Welcome to our deep dive into the Communist Manifesto, which famously begins with
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communism. The communists.
The communists.
The communists.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
Welcome to the Spectre of Communism podcast. I suppose you could have called it the Frightful Hobgoblin podcast. We were following the original English translation of the Communist Manifesto, which is part of the Classics of Marxism Volume 1, available from Well-Read Books. I'll put it in the description of this episode. This season of the Spectre of Communism podcast has been all about getting back to basics. We opened the season with a full timeline of the Russian Revolution of 1917, the greatest event in human history, and an event guided explicitly by the principles laid down by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in this short but incredibly influential and rich text. And we're ending this season of the podcast by going through chapter by chapter the arguments and the historical context of the Communist Manifesto so that you can understand it on a deeper level. And to help us with that, we have Josh Holroyd, who is a member of the leadership of the Revolutionary Communist International and also editor of our theoretical journal in defense of Marxism. Josh, thank you so much for coming on the show once again.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for having me.
So, the Communist Manifesto is sometimes said to be the second best-selling book of all time after the Bible. It's certainly one of the most influential texts of all time. And I dare say that it was personally influential for you, Josh. It was for me. For a lot of people who become radicalized and become communist, this is the first thing that you read. So, what do you think the significance of the Communist Manifesto really is to the world? And what was your personal story with relation to the Communist Manifesto? I'm sure you have one.
Yeah, I do. And that in terms of the significance, I mean, I would say it's the greatest work of political literature ever written in history. One of the greatest works of literature in general in history, I would say. And I don't just mean that in terms of the quality writing, the form, which I think is phenomenal, with some wonderful poetry, really. Some of the lines, for instance, the first line that we had in the cold open. Iconic lines, as you put it. But beyond that to this day, it has continued to ring true in a way that is incredibly powerful for people. As you mentioned, I mean, I think that the proof of that is in the experience that I'm sure millions of people around the world have had reading it for the first time, whether it's the first piece of political literature they've read or not, whether it's the first piece of Marxist literature they've read or not. When you read the manifesto, I remember having this feeling of, you talk about something being eye-opening and opening your mind, broadening your horizons. I could almost physically feel my mind being expanded, my horizons being expanded by reading this book. And you might be thinking, I mean, I'm giving away my age here. It was quite a long time ago that I read the manifesto for the first time. So you might be wondering, well, how do you remember that so clearly? First of all, because it was a pivotal experience in my life, but also rereading the text before recording this episode, I had the same feeling again. There aren't many, I cannot think of many books where I've lost count of the number of times I've read this book, and every time I read it, it gives me something more. Because really what it succeeds in doing is grasping a deep, profound truth about the society in which we live. Even though it was written in 1847, 1848, it's referring to historical figures and parties that don't exist. Some of the specific demands and so on are no longer applicable to today, and we're going to get into that in the detail of the discussion. But still, the process, the logic that it brings out in this such a clear and beautiful form is, I would say, it's unique. I mean, there aren't many other books of the era that are even still talked about, let alone widely read. And I think that says something about the importance of this. And one other thing I'd mention is the role that it's played and the influence it's had on the workers' movement. There's actually a preface in which Engels later on writes that the history of the Communist Manifesto, by which he means the actual text and the spread of the text, reflects the history of the workers' movement itself. Wherever countries begin to industrialize and you have a larger working class and the emergence of a workers' movement, you notice new translations of the Communist Manifesto coming out. And that also says something about the power of this book, that as the working class has developed and become conscious of its position in society, it has reached out for something that can explain the society in which it's lived and its role in society. And the Communist Manifesto, more than any other book, has done that and continues to do that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I first read the Communist Manifesto on the first year of my university English literature course. And, I read a lot of things that year as part of my studies, some good, some bad, some indifferent, but the Communist Manifesto, it just felt like a bright light. It felt so relevant, so clear. It's so lean as well. In the space of 34 slight pages, there's so much depth of analysis.
Yeah.
And as you say, it's a point that Alan, our main leader and theoretician, likes to make, that this, unlike all of the various political treatises that were written at the time and political manifestos written at the time, and there were many because it was a revolutionary period, all of those are of a merely historical interest, actual relevance to the modern day nil. But the Communist Manifesto, and hopefully this comes across in the discussion, it was ahead of its time. It speaks more to the world of today than it did to the world of 1847, 1848. So not only...
Arguably, yeah.
Not only is it still relevant, I would say it's grown into its relevance. It's matured into the modern world.
And as long as capitalism exists, it will only become more and more relevant.
So that opening line, it's so iconic. A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. And that's from the preamble, where Marx and Engels talk about the way in which there is no party genuinely in opposition to the ruling class, to the powers that be, that has not been decried as communistic by its opponents in power. And that feels very apposite. That feels very contemporary, because you still hear the word communism thrown around, like a bogeyman by a spectre, in fact, by the ruling class and their mouthpieces today. So what was the context in which Marx and Engels were writing this book?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that it does ring true today. Only last month, was it, Trump was decrying Zoran Mamdani as a communist. And it's not even sort of socialist or democratic socialist politicians that get called communists. I remember the right wing in America called Barack Obama a communist. So the way that Marx paints this hysteria around communism, the threat of communism everywhere, it's something that still applies to this day. But it is actually, it was something, Marx was drawing on something very real at the time. I think maybe people reading it today might think, oh, this is an exaggeration, isn't it? This is an iconic, as you said, really bold, dramatic introduction. But it was actually the case that there was a great fear of communism, particularly in France at the time. The Communist Manifesto work began on it in 1847. The manifesto was finished off and published in early 1848. So Europe was on the cusp of a huge wave of revolutions at this time. And everybody knew it as well at this time. Even representatives of the ruling class were standing up in Parliament. Alexis de Tocqueville, a liberal member of Parliament in France, stood up in Parliament and said, "I believe we are sleeping on top of a volcano." That was the mood in society at this time. And you had, in the respectable bourgeois press, accusations of communism being hurled against radical papers. So when I talk about radical, I mean kind of radical Democrats. At this time, nowhere did there exist real universal suffrage, even universal male suffrage. And so people campaigning for universal suffrage were often referred to as Democrats or radicals. And you would have political rallies or banquets, as they were sometimes kind of styled as, where toasts were drunk, speeches were made, and radicals would stand up and refuse to toast to the king. France had a king at this time, and instead toast to the people or something like that. And then in the pages of the respectable press, this was decried as communism. Meanwhile, parties accused of communism, it mentions it in the manifesto, would hurl the accusation back at their enemy. So there was this sense that that first revolution was in the air, that communism was a force to be reckoned with. But there was also a lot of confusion, some honest, some deliberate, about what communism actually represented. So you can see some of the context in which Marx is saying it is now time for the Communist Party, for the real communists, to openly declare what they stand for and what they're about.
Mm-hmm. And we'll hop into the actual contents of the manifesto in a moment. But first of all, for whom were Marx and Engels writing this book? I should also say that we have a previous episode of our predecessor podcast, actually, International Marxist Radio, where Josh talks about Marx and Engels' early political work and the kind of run-up to the writing of the Communist Manifesto. I'll link that in the description for context as well. But just very quickly, for whom was this text actually written? Of what organisation was this the manifesto?
This was the manifesto of an organisation called the Communist League. The Communist League originally was called the League of the Just. It changed its name to the Communist League in 1847, and I'll briefly explain why. But it had come into being, the League of the Just had come into being. It was an organisation made up of German workers, largely. You had populations of migrant German workers in many major European cities, a large population of Germans in Paris, in London. It's worth remembering that Germany was split up into a number of states, feudal monarchies and duchies, absolutist monarchies, so powerful bureaucratic monarchies such as the Kingdom of Prussia. And so as you can imagine, there was no even bourgeois democracy at this time, certainly not universal suffrage or anything like that. And so workers, intellectuals who had been drawn into the revolutionary movement were necessarily driven underground or into exile. And in this context, you had German workers coming into contact with the developing socialist and communist movement in France. You had a number of different socialist and explicitly communist trends that were emerging. Again, these groups were more or less underground as well, because although you've had the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, after that you have the restoration of the old monarchy, another revolution in July of 1830, which introduces a new monarchy, but that monarchy immediately clamps down on any resistance, just to briefly put people in the picture of what society looked like at this time. And so you have lots of different secret societies and underground organizations, conspiratorial societies that were discussing and debating communist ideas. And the League of the Just was one of them. Its ideas you could describe as fairly utopian, in the sense that it had this kind of grand view of a new socialist man, a moral rejuvenation, a new Jerusalem, if you like, which was accompanied with, it was a largely religious organization, a Christian organization. So it was like a Christian communist underground conspiratorial society made up of overwhelmingly German workers. And it actually participated in an attempted insurrection and uprising in 1839 alongside a similar organization in France, which was defeated. And so the League of the Just had to go into exile. Bringing this forward, though, in the meantime, in 1844, Marx and Engels have begun their historic collaboration. They meet in August of 1844 and begin working together and start to develop what we now know as Marxist theory, Marxist philosophy, historical materialism. And they draw the conclusion that it's necessary also to get politically active. They start as, I don't know if you can even call that an organization, they start as just the two of them. Engaging in discussions within these German populations in places like Paris in particular. And they set up an organization called the Communist Correspondence Committee in Brussels, where Marx was based at that time, which it wasn't really like a political party. They were trying to really lay the foundations for a revolutionary party by contacting people with similar ideas to open up at least debate and to get ideological clarity, to understand the political situation, but also to join together for a party of action. And it's around this time in 1847 that a leading figure in the League of the Just, called Joseph Moll, comes to visit Marx and Engels in Brussels. And he says, basically, that we, a decisive section of the leadership of the League of the Just, have been won over by your ideas. We've read what material has been produced. They have also participated in debates and discussions in the same milieu, the same environment as Marx and Engels. And we think you're right, basically. And what we want you to do is, first of all, join the League. Marx and Engels knew of the League, but had not joined because they disagreed with the kind of religious utopian ideas of the group and the conspiratorial methods. And so they invited to, first of all, join and attend a congress or a conference that took place in June of 1847, where their ideas would be presented to the delegates to the Congress, and basically the organization would be changed along with their ideas. So at this June conference, first of all, the name is changed to the Communist League. But also the old conspiratorial setup, these underground cells where you didn't really have any democratic structures because everyone was anonymous and effectively in hiding. This was transformed. Along lines of what we today would call democratic centralism, actually. You had elected committees which were accountable to the membership, democratic congresses and so on. And this was Marx and Engels' insistence. If it's of interest, they got this idea from the emerging workers' market movement itself. For instance, the Chartist movement in Britain, which was an organised movement and a political party of the working class. In fact, the first national political party of the working class in history. But anyway, to move on, it was agreed that the new constitution and a brief sketch of the new principles of the organisation, sketched by Engels, it's called a draft Communist Confession of Faith, would be circulated to the membership, and then a second conference would take place in November to December of that year. And at that conference, in November to December, Marx attended, set out his and Engels' ideas, won the support of the conference, and then Marx and Engels were delegated, they were commissioned to draw up the manifesto of the Communist League, and that is how the Communist Manifesto came into being.
There we are.
It was the joint work of Marx and Engels. I mentioned this draft Confession of Faith by Engels. He also wrote a document called the Principles of Communism in the summer of 1847, which he sent to Marx. And there are sections of the manifesto that have clearly been taken, but Marx did the final write-up, basically. So the document as a whole was written by Marx, but with a very strong presence of Engels' own writing and ideas from the documents I've mentioned before.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's hop into chapter 1, Bourgeois and Proletarians. And I have to say that when I was preparing for this podcast, it was such an amazing opportunity to remind myself of how incredible this chapter is. There's so much depth to Marx and Engels' analysis in so few words. They basically give this really compelling and detailed overview of the developments of class society from earlier forms like feudalism all the way up to capitalism. And they give an overview of the method of historical materialism. And this chapter also contains one of the foundational statements of Marxism, which is the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. So let's begin there, Josh. Let's unpack that statement a bit.
Sure. And yeah, to start, I completely agree with you. The number of ideas and the clarity of ideas contained in this chapter is absolutely breathtaking. They somehow managed to give a potted history of the last 2,000 years, if not more, with also a beautiful summary of all of their ideas, Marx and Engels' ideas, up until this point. And yes, this idea about all of the history of all hitherto existing society being history of the class struggle, it's so famous and so common today. I think sometimes the revolutionary significance of that is sometimes lost. In fact, this was a very powerful statement. It wasn't just a revolutionary statement, it was a scientific statement as well. Up until this point, the understanding of history was much more linked to the either the realization of certain eternal ideas. That might be liberal ideas, such as free exchange and so on, or some kind of moral order that humanity is trying to progress to or falling further from, or determined by the actions of great men, the kings and queens of history and so on. By grounding it in the class struggle, Marx is not only pointing to the struggle of the oppressed, that's one side of it, but also he is making a statement, as you said, of historical materialism, because on what are the different classes in society founded? And one thing that I wanted to unpick here is, what do we mean by class struggle? When Marx says that history is history of class struggle, what does that actually mean? First of all, what are classes? Social classes are the distinctions that society is divided up into. Often often you see differences in wealth, but what Marx explained is that class is not just the distinction between rich and poor, which we can see all around us. There's an element of truth to that, but that what decides the position of different classes in society is their relationship to production itself and to the ownership of the means of production. So when Marx is saying this, he's pointed out that throughout history, certainly of the last few thousand years, you have had a productive base of the economy in which one section of, at least one section of society or several sections of society have had a privileged role, have had ownership over the means of production, what is required to produce the needs of life, and also have had a dominant position over the majority of society, the people producing in the fields, in modern society, in the factories, and so on. And again, this is an extremely profound statement. One thing that I wanted to add to that is that later on, Marx and Engels studied in quite a lot of depth societies from all over the world, including ancient prehistoric societies. They read scientific works on anthropology and archaeology, and flowing from these, they came to the conclusion that actually prior to the rise, so in other words, class society itself and the class struggle is something that has evolved. It's not actually an eternal feature of society, that thousands of years ago, actually, what Engels described as primitive communism was a universal stage of our social evolution, by which I mean there weren't classes, that the means of production were owned and in many cases used communally. So you don't have this division of society between have-nots and haves and have-nots, of exploiters and exploited. However, once that state of affairs has come into being, around 5,000 years ago, and has evidently only become stronger, then the foundation of society has always contained this antagonism, this conflict between different classes. Lenin described the class struggle as a struggle over the surplus. In other words, that the exploited class, the majority, are producing more wealth, more food and so on than they consume, and you have this elite, this privileged class that is taking that surplus. But another question that is contained that flows from this statement is, okay, well, if the history of all society for the last 5,000 years, say, has been one of class struggle, has it always been the same struggle between the same classes? And Marx immediately answers in the negative. And this actually raises quite a fascinating question of philosophy. The Communist Manifesto doesn't speak explicitly about philosophy in philosophical terms, but clearly it's a work grounded in Marxist philosophy, which Marx and Engels had developed to an advanced state by this time. And so what we see is, okay, the class struggle and class society has gone through many different forms and different stages of evolution. A lawful evolution, like we see with the evolution of species. Engels was actually quite fond of comparing Marx's ideas to those of Darwin, another great mind of the 19th century. And so in this first chapter, in the first part, you have a sweeping but still very concrete and correct history of that social evolution. He talks about freemen and slaves in ancient Greco-Roman society. He talks about patricians and plebeians in Roman society again. He talks about the lords and the serfs in feudalism. Obviously, he's talking about European history at this time. But you see that these different class struggles are not something they're not something eternal. Mm-hmm. They're not something arbitrary, that there was some like accidental disagreement and then all of a sudden you had the division into classes. It's something that is determined, something that is capable of being scientifically understood, and that has followed a pattern of evolution through stages. And this is also a very powerful idea, which is important to hang on to because it has important ramifications for the conclusions that Marx makes at the end of this chapter. But yeah, he shows how through stages we reach the capitalist society. That capitalism and the society that he was writing about, the society we live in now, is not something eternal. We have not just had thousands and thousands of years of private companies with wage workers producing for the market. This is actually something that has evolved.
Mm-hmm. And a distinct feature of our epoch, Marx and Engels argue in the manifesto, I quote, is it has simplified class antagonisms. So you talked about the development of these different classes and different forms of class antagonism over the course of history. And a point that Marx and Engels make is that in earlier forms of class society, you have a greater diversity of social classes. So under feudalism, for example, you've got the aristocracy, the landed gentry, the yeomen, the peasantry. But a feature of capitalism is that pretty much everyone is only either a member of the bourgeois, the capitalist class, or the proletariat, the working class. And that's a very forward-thinking statement because it wasn't true of the world that Marx and Engels were writing in 1847, but it is true of the world today. In much of the world, that is the case. Obviously, you do still have a peasantry in some parts of the world, but in certainly the advanced capitalist countries, that's true. Everyone is either a boss, someone who employs other people to work for them, or they are a worker who sells their ability to work in order to pay their rents, to buy their food, etc. There's a point in this chapter where I quote again, Marx and Engels talk about the bourgeoisie also stripping of its halo every occupation hitherto honoured and looked up to with reverent awe, converting the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage labourers. And I was thinking, as we speak, there's a dispute by university lecturers going on in Britain, in this country. And in the last period, you've seen these so-called, middle-class, white-collar professions like doctors and nurses and teachers
And lawyers.
Pressed into the ranks of the working class increasingly and having to use class struggle methods in order to defend their conditions. So again, this is something which feels like it speaks more to the world of 2025 than to the world of 1847.
Yeah, I think you're right. Both those points you raised are great examples of the manifesto being far ahead of its time and prophetic. Not in the sense that Marx was arbitrarily just making a guess. You know how some people guess, like, well, in the future we'll have hover cars or something like that?
Yeah.
It's something much, much deeper than that, that he was analysing processes that were taking place. When we say the world didn't look like that in 1847, it was there to be seen, but it was emerging. Only really in Britain could you say that state of affairs was largely present, even then it wasn't absolute. No society has ever been exclusively made up of capitalists and wage workers and proletarians. But in Britain, you had a mass working class working in factories. You had a capitalist class which was dominant, in control of the state. So a lot of what the manifesto says about capitalism has been drawn directly from the example of Britain. But taking that concrete example, Marx has seen under the surface that there is a necessary process going on here, that Britain, not in all its forms, but that process of development, the creation of a working class, the working class becoming the majority of society, this is something that is necessary to the very functioning of capitalism itself, a system which was spreading across the world at that time. Other countries were beginning to industrialize. And so what he saw was the underlying truth and necessity of that. And of course, living in a global capitalist society, it's come more and more to fruition with every passing decade. Mm-hmm. I mean, you think about there was already a large working class in China, but you think about the growth of the working class and the urban working class in China over the last 20 years. This only confirms again and again the words of the manifesto. But yes, back in the 1840s, it was Britain, and then in France, the overwhelming majority of the population were peasants living and working in the countryside. There was a working class in France, working in mines, in workshops, but kind of assembled in large factories, like in Manchester of the period. Not quite yet. You had railway construction, and so a working class working on transport and the construction of the railways. I won't give an exhaustive list, but one important thing to point out is that the working class was the minority even in the cities, not just in the country. That's not the case today, is it? In Germany, obviously a unified Germany didn't exist, but the peasantry, the rural population was overwhelmingly the majority, and the workers were an even smaller proportion of society than France. So yeah, when Marx and Engels are writing this, they are looking at the necessary logic of capitalism rather than trying to paint an accurate portrait of capitalism as it existed in the 1840s.
Could you give a little bit more detail about the mechanism by which capitalism converts everybody either into one of these two classes? Why should it be that that's the case under capitalism?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I guess to start, what do we mean by capitalism? So one important element is the production of commodities, as opposed to producing for your own use, or directly for the use of another person, such as under feudalism. Certainly the beginnings of feudalism, the serfs would produce food and clothing and so on and just give it straight to the lord. They weren't selling it to the lord. They weren't selling it on the market for the lord to buy eventually or anything like that. Under capitalism, that's clearly not the case, that almost all the producers are producing for the market, producing commodities to be sold on the market, but also you have bourgeois property, private ownership of the means of production. And the phenomenon where a capitalist, who, if you like, is the personification, the embodiment of capital, has a certain quantity of value, usually money. He invests in machinery and factory space, whatever it is you need, and he's actually buying the ability of other people to work, to come and produce on his behalf, essentially, and he has ownership over all of it. So the end product is not the property of the worker who's produced it, but rather the property of a capitalist. as the chapter explains, this has developed through quite a long process of evolution. But when you have merchants, or the term bourgeois, it comes across in the chapter. The term bourgeois originally meant a town dweller. It was basically a French term for a town dweller under feudalism. But these kind of urban, private owning producers and merchants, as they gain control over production, as they're able to find people that come and work in their workshops, they make profit. And this is another key ingredient for capitalism. It's not producing on the market for everybody's health. It's not producing on the market to satisfy the needs of humanity. It's so that you can make a greater quantity of money than you put into it in the first place. Otherwise, you have no capital, you have no capitalists. And so once capitalist production gets going, and for that you need the development of the market, you have the development of the world market. Marx talks about it in after the discovery of the Americas, the development of the world market as it existed at that time, the development of a home market and a national market, a mass of consumers that need to buy basics like food and clothing that in the past they would have just produced themselves. Once you have that, and you have this class of individual capitalists starting to employ the labor of others in this capitalistic fashion, you have what Marx later describes as the accumulation of capital. They're making profits. And one thing that I'm sure we've all noticed is that, well, it's less and less the case today, but that's another story. But the capitalists, having made a profit, they will often reinvest that in order to expand production or break out into new markets. Why? So they can make even more profit. Mm-hmm. And so you have this process of the successful capitalists making profits, expanding production. But in order to expand production, what do you need as a capitalist? Yes, you need the raw materials, you need more machinery, but you also need more workers. So the more successful the capitalists are, and the more they want to expand their mode of production, to use Marx's expression, the more workers they need. And so you see this, not only in Britain, but across the world over the last couple of centuries, is the proletarianization of the population. Mm-hmm. Peasants being drawn into the cities to work in the factories, sometimes voluntarily because they're driven by poverty in the countryside into the cities, sometimes not so voluntarily. One thing that you saw in England in particular was enclosures where peasants were simply kicked off their land and turned into paupers, so they'd have to work. But to bring a long story short, you have this growth of the working class alongside the development of capitalist production. Mm-hmm. And, we've seen that the last 100 years has been an explosion of world population, an explosion of the urban population. Why? Because capitalism has only continued to grow.
Yeah, to quote the manifesto directly, the bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization, into capitalist civilization. It talks about agglomerating the population, so this rapid urbanization. You talk about centralizing of the means of production into these urban centers, into these big factories, and concentrating property in a few hands. So you have a small number of capitalists who own all the private property, and the workers increasingly drawn into these dense centers of production. And this becomes, as you say, a global process. Capitalism literally takes over the world, and Marx and Engels described this at a point where that was only just beginning to happen. And as you say, you only really saw it in the sense that we know now in England.
And to add another thing, I've talked about how the peasantry becomes proletarianized, but also within the cities. I mentioned that the majority of the Parisian population were actually working class. Well, what were they then? They were what Marx and Engels described as petty bourgeois.
Yes.
Petty or petit in French meaning small bourgeois. And so small property owners. If a proletarian, if a worker is someone who owns no property, certainly no means of production, and therefore has to sell their ability to work to somebody else in order to make a living, a petty bourgeois is somebody who owns maybe their own tools, their own small workshop, maybe they work out their own home, but they work for themselves on their own account. Perhaps they own their own shop. So somebody who works on their own account, but I guess you'd call them a small business owner or somebody who's self-employed. They constituted the majority of the Parisian population at this time. And Marx points out in the manifesto that they are already undergoing a process of dissolution, by which I mean many of them had simply been driven out of business. Let's say if you're a weaver, this was a big deal in Britain at the time, you're a weaver weaving cloth, and all of a sudden new machinery is introduced, and you have massive factories that can produce the same amount as you in a tiny fraction of the time and totally undercut you on price, then they went out of business. And they, with their weaving skills, often ended up working in the factories that had displaced them. So that section of the petty bourgeoisie is proletarianized. Meanwhile, the most successful layer succeeds in becoming capitalist, becoming bourgeois. So that's also why Marx describes the petty bourgeoisie in another work as a transition class. It's very unstable because it's basically constantly been torn apart between the other contending classes. That's another part of the meaning when he says that the class struggle is simplified. I don't think that Marx literally meant that either when he was writing or in the future, there would be literally no other classes on the planet. But certainly class relations compared to the past have been simplified because the capitalists and the proletariat are sucking, if you like, people from all the other classes in society into their ranks because of the logic of production, which we've already discussed.
So you talked about how the manifesto sort of distills all the other pieces of work that Marx and Engels were already working on. One of the most important of this period, of course, is Marx's great study of capitalism as a system, Das Kapital, which he developed later. And in this chapter, Marx and Engels talk about the crisis that is implicit in the capitalist mode of production, about the reasons that capitalism goes through periodic crises, and the particular feature being the epidemic, as they put it, of overproduction. So I'm just going to read a little bit again. They say, modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. And as I said, they say that in periods of crisis, there breaks out under capitalism an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. So could we just unpack this? What do Marx and Engels mean by the epidemic of overproduction that's peculiar to capitalism, and why is that related to capitalist crisis?
Yes, overproduction was something that economists, even beyond Marx and Engels at the time, were talking about more and more. Again, this is actually another example of Marx and Engels being fairly ahead of their time. You had crises of overproduction under capitalism, but not actually that many by this early stage. Before then, most crises you had were what you'd probably describe as underproduction. Famines, for instance, where people are starving and you have crisis because not enough is being produced. So the significance of overproduction is you had this phenomenon where, again, going back to the essence of capitalist production, you are producing for a market. You're not producing if you're a capitalist, you're not producing in a planned way, society needs this number of houses or this number of shoes, and we will find the resources in order to do that. It's you're producing for a market which is inherently anarchic. You as a producer don't actually know how much can be absorbed by the market. The market, of course, doesn't just reflect human need, it reflects the ability of real human beings to pay for these goods. It's not just how much people want things, it's their ability to pay for it as well. So the market is necessarily limited. It's limited by the actual needs of society, and it's limited by the ability of society to pay. At the same time, the main way that capitalists compete with one another is by undercutting each other. The most effective way to undercut your competitors is to find a more efficient way to produce more cheaply. One way you can do that is by introducing more machinery or better technique. So let's say for the hypothetical example, you manage to somehow double your rate of production. You then will be able to sell those products much more cheaply than your competitor and capture a larger share of the market. So you're expanding production in order to capture a larger share. At the same time, another way you can produce more cheaply is by squeezing the workforce, make them work for longer or for less if you can get away with it. And so, the class struggle under capitalism is this constant push and pull between the workers and capitalists on precisely this question. But that means that you have an entire class of producers who are producing as much as they possibly can, straining all limits, whilst at the same time, you've already got a market which is limited by certain factors. But in order to expand production as cheaply as possible, they are also even starting to suppress the purchasing power of the working class, which in a society like Britain at that time was the majority, and today is the majority. And this builds towards a contradiction, that the objective limits of the market, which cannot simply be overcome, they can be temporarily suspended with things like credit, they can't be just wished away out of existence, comes into sharp conflict with this constantly expanding production. And so it's overproduction because you have goods that can no longer be sold and businesses that go bust. The example that Marx will have had in his mind when he was writing finishing off the Communist Manifesto was the major recession of 1847. He talks, this is later when he talks in detail about the crisis, but he talks about how factories in Britain had sold their goods to wholesalers, which then took them to foreign markets like Singapore, who then sold them to merchants there. So they were selling at a wholesale rate. Once sold, they were like, brilliant, I've made a profit, and would expand production even further. So everything's hunky-dory. The problem was, Marx explains that you had whole shipments of these goods just sitting idle in the docks in Singapore because no one was actually buying them. But nobody back home in Britain knows this because they're all selling on credit, basically. Both the capitalists and the merchants and so on are all basically borrowing to keep expanding production because they're expecting things to get better and better and better. Mm-hmm. And of course, the banks and financiers are lending that money, getting interest, so they're making a profit. So it seems, all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. But then when finally they realize that these goods aren't being sold, the merchants, over in Singapore and these markets go bust, then you have this huge crisis of confidence. All of a sudden, everyone wants their debts repaid immediately. The banks are saying, where's my money? Businesses go bust. Workers are thrown out of the factories into mass unemployment, and you have periods of deep, deep crisis. Mm-hmm. This is what the epidemic that Marx is talking about. This was actually happening as Marx was writing the manifesto. So it was a very live experience in the book.
And again, how ahead of its time does this feel? You're going to get sick of hearing me say this, but how ahead of its time does this feel? We're still living in the shadow of the 2008 crisis, which reflected an organic crisis of overproduction in capitalism. And we're on the cusp of this massive inflated AI bubble that's not even really just a bubble. It's a series of bubbles sort of frothing around this glut of investment on assumed productivity in the future that's basically propping up the entire world economy. And everybody can see that a disaster's on the way. From the wealthiest investors, the likes of Elon Musk, and all the way through to the average worker in the street waiting for the next big economic calamity. This is something that we've lived through in our lifetimes on a massive scale, and you see it reflected in the pages of the Communist Manifesto.
Absolutely. And one thing I want to point out is the first time I read this, it would have been something like 2005. So before 2008. At that time, the British government had announced that they had abolished the boom and bust cycle.
Oh, that's good. That's a relief.
So at that time, I was speaking to people about this amazing book I've read, and they said, no, that's not right. Capitalism doesn't have those crises anymore because we're able to use state subsidies and expanding credit and so on. And that is something that has changed to an extent, not that they've abolished crises, but the way they respond to crises has changed since Marx and Engels wrote the manifesto. Back in 1847, the currencies were often linked to gold. So what happened was when businesses started going bust, the Bank of England, rather than expanding the money supply with what was called quantitative easing after 2008, it actually restricted it so that it wouldn't lose all the gold from its vaults. And so you had mass unemployment, huge crisis. Eventually, you see in the 20th century that the ruling class become terrified of the prospect of mass unemployment because of the class struggle, because the working class is bigger, and they were worried about revolution. And so you start having things like inflationary policies, Keynesian measures to stabilize the government. That's why the Labour government, back when I first read the manifesto, claimed that they'd abolished boom and bust. Then only a few years later, we have, the Great Recession of 2008. And people often say like, oh, well, that was just a financial crisis. But why was it that, first of all, the financial markets were lending out of all proportion and so irresponsibly? Why were they lending to these subprime mortgages? In other words, lending to people who couldn't pay it back and then selling it on to make more profit. It's because they couldn't invest profitably in real industry, in the real economy. So they were speculating on a scale far out of proportion to what Marx will have seen. Marx did see financial speculation, he wrote about it, but the scale of it is greater than in his day. The essence of it hasn't changed. And so when that whole rotten edifice was brought down in 2007, 2008, one of the reasons why it pulled down the economy with it to a very serious world recession, with millions of people thrown out of employment, was precisely because so many of these businesses were completely reliant on credit. They basically weren't able to sell their products profitably on a scale enough to even keep their operations going, let alone expand their operations. And so they went bust. And actually, the funny thing is that not only have they not abolished boom and bust, we haven't experienced a real boom, since 2008.
No.
If capitalism's managed to abolish anything, it looks like it's booms. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily abolished it for good, but the point I'm making is that we haven't actually escaped the crisis of 2008. When Marx was writing the manifesto, even when he was writing Capital, these crises of overproduction would usually be followed by an upswing not that long after. Capitalism in those days was actually in a healthier state. It really speaks to the degeneracy and rottenness of capitalism today, that despite all these, this financial wizardry, the capitalist system is incapable of lifting itself out of this crisis. And one other point I'd like to make about overproduction is, throughout this whole period, the period which we've been living through recently, we've had this phenomenon of excess capacity. For instance, in the steel industry, the productive capacity of the steel industry is many times over the actual demand that exists in the market. People are worried about Chinese excess capacity, not only in steel, but in electric vehicles. In other words, these products, there are more of these products being produced, and the capacity of industry to produce these far outweighs the actual needs of society, and therefore also the ability to realize the value contained in these profits, to these commodities, to sell these commodities profitably, which is, of course, paving the way for more conflicts over trade, more protectionism as markets trying to protect themselves against Chinese so-called dumping, but also for future crises. So you can see this spectre, if you like, of overproduction hanging over the economy constantly in our era. Oh, and you mentioned the AI boom. Obviously, AI did not exist in Marx's day, but Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, tech billionaire, has compared the present boom in AI, speculation in AI, to the railway boom of the 1840s, which Marx did live through. And so you had a huge amount of speculative investment into this revolutionary technology, and it did prove to be a revolutionary technology, but many of these railways were never built, many of these businesses went bust, which was a major contribution to the crisis of the 1840s that Marx witnessed and wrote about. So you see that capitalism fundamentally hasn't changed at all in all these years. The last thing I'd mention about that is it's very interesting that Bezos refers to this, because the collapse of the railway boom led in no small part to the revolutions of 1848. So watch this space.
Well, it's like that joke that you keep seeing online about, well, Marx never considered, and then someone finds a line where Marx considered precisely that. There's much we could say on this chapter. We could spend an entire episode on this chapter alone, actually. But the last thing I want to talk about is another famous quote or paraphrase from this chapter, where Marx and Engels talk about the bourgeois forging the weapons that bring death to it and calling into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletariats. So they say that the bourgeoisie bring their own gravediggers into being. And not only that, they say the proletariat is the only truly revolutionary class under capitalism. So just to round off this chapter, can you just expound on both of those points?
Yeah, of course. One thing I want to point out is, as I mentioned before, Marx and Engels don't talk explicitly about philosophy in this book, but you can really see the presence of Marx's philosophy in precisely that statement. The idea that capitalism produces its own gravediggers is summing up this dialectical idea that all things eventually turn into their opposites, produce their opposites. Earlier on in the chapter, he talks about how feudalism produced the bourgeoisie and with it the capitalist order. And this logic, this kind of logic of evolution, is building towards this inspiring conclusion of the first chapter, where he says that just as the bourgeoisie was nurtured within the womb of feudalism and eventually broke out of that in a revolutionary struggle based on its material interests, so too the working class has been created by capitalism. It's been developed, it's become stronger. He also talks in the chapter, I won't go into detail, but he talks about how, well, as the working class has come into being, it has had to enter into struggle with the capitalists, with its exploiters and oppressors. The workers, in order to carry out that struggle, have formed organizations like trade unions. They've even formed political parties. In fact, only one workers' political party existed at the time, again, but he's drawing the conclusions from that. And a political party does what? It ultimately struggles for power. So he's saying, irrespective of the ideas of Marx and Engels, or of any theoretician, there is this objective struggle taking place, an undeniable struggle taking place, which has actually been created by capitalism itself. It's not been created by some external reformer saying, oh, you should do this, you should do that. And this was a key part of Marx and Engels' ideas, what they call scientific socialism or scientific communism, where their communism was based on the recognition of the real process of development of society itself and the class struggle, not simply how they think society should be. And I want to touch on why the proletariat was for them the only revolutionary class. It's not simply that the proletariat is without property and therefore the most oppressed. The proletariat is oppressed and heavily exploited. It's not necessarily always the poorest class in society. That's not what they were getting at. The reason that the proletariat is the only really... also, another thing they're not saying is that no other class would ever participate in a revolution. If that's the case, then in majority peasant countries, you would be on a hiding to nothing. What they're saying is that the working class is the really revolutionary class because it, first of all, increasingly, the more the working class develops, the more capitalism develops, increasingly the wealth of society is produced by wage workers. They're the people who are actually running the economy on the ground. They're the people who almost literally hold the levers of production in their hands. Therefore, they can bring the economy to a standstill. And more importantly, they could actually run it without the bosses. At a certain stage, the workers could quite happily and easily run the economy in a more efficient way than the capitalists themselves. You can't say that about the petty bourgeoisie, such as the shop owners and the self-employed. You can't say that about the peasantry. But another factor is the conditions of life of these different classes, which still, in their fundamental outlines, still applies today. The peasants obviously live more geographically isolated, smaller populations in villages and so on. They live on their own farm. They have to focus on producing on their own farm. They will produce with other people, family. They might get hired labour in. But we're not talking about modern industrial production when thousands of workers within a single enterprise are necessarily thrown together. They have to collaborate, cooperate in order to work, and they also have to collaborate in order to struggle together for better wages and conditions. So that kind of collective struggle and collective way of working, which is inherent to being working class, it's an inherent part of the working class as a class, also means that it is capable of transforming society. So when it says the really revolutionary class, it doesn't mean that they're the only people who would participate in an uprising. The revolution here is the social revolution. It is the class that carries within it the seeds of a new social order, of communism. Whereas the other classes, they can actually, and I think the manifesto actually does talk about this, that the petty bourgeoisie can join up with the proletariat, but in reality, when the petty bourgeoisie does join the proletariat in a revolutionary struggle, it's looking after its future rather than its present, because it is looking at its own kind of destruction by capitalist competition. So in order to survive, if you like, it binds together with the proletariat. But it's the proletariat that leads the way. And this was obviously very relevant. There were many different trends when Marx was writing who were advocating, oh, well, the peasants, because they're the poorest often, the peasants actually should lead the revolution. And then the majority of society, it's not a ridiculous thing to say in the 1840s, to be honest, but that idea had to be taken up, and it was taken up in the Communist Manifesto. Today, in Britain, France, Germany, there isn't really a peasantry at all. The working class is the absolute majority of society. So it's very easy to read the manifesto and think, of course. But it's still not actually the case in all countries. I would say this question of the role of the working class is still, certainly in the last 50 years, has been a live debate in the class struggle and the revolutionary struggle in many African countries, for instance. Most African countries, the working class is a minority of the population. In many African countries, the working class is a minority of the urban population. And that poses certain difficulties and challenges to the worker struggle. And yet, there are still workers with their organisations struggling against capitalism. They remain the most revolutionary class, clearly. But yeah, this question is one that is still discussed, and I would say that the manifesto remains as applicable to countries where this debate is taking place today as it was in 1840 or 1847. Sorry.
All right, we're going to move to chapter 2, Proletarians and Communists. So this is the chapter where Marx and Engels talk about the relation of the communists to the rest of the working class, and they talk about the communists practically being, I quote, the most advanced and resolute section of the working class organisations, the working class parties of every country, the section that pushes forward all the others. But they also say, theoretically, they have the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the workers' movement. So can we dig into this a little bit? What are Marx and Engels trying to say about what we communists, organised communists, should do in relation to the rest of the class?
Yeah, well, I mean, beyond what you've already read out, Marx and Engels are taking up an extremely important point, one that communists today still need to think very hard and very deeply about. which is how do we avoid the pitfalls of either sectarianism on the one hand, and essentially irrelevance, preaching from the sidelines, but also what is often referred to as opportunism, by which I mean simply tail-ending the movement and actually losing your communist identity. How many movements and parties over the last 100 years, say, have we seen that happen to? It's something that Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolsheviks wrote about and discussed extensively. And the kernel of the genuine, correct communist position is so well expressed here and so precisely. Sectarianism was a thing in the 1840s. The difference is that the sects that Marx and Engels were writing about were groups that, we'll touch on this a little bit later, but what was described as the utopian socialists, where, to give one concrete example, there was a group around Robert Owen in Britain at the time, who had played a good role in the movement, had set up the first national trade union confederation in Britain. But then when the Chartist movement broke out, the Chartist movement, if anyone's not aware, was a movement of the working class to win universal suffrage, to win the vote. So on the face of it, just a political reform under capitalism. However, beyond that, the workers wanted to use the vote in order to win their own social demands and even put into power a workers' government. So the logic of the class struggle was already pouring through. However, the Owenites in Britain at that time said, well, because this is just looking for political reform under capitalism, it's not actually trying to establish socialism or transform society. It's therefore a bit of a waste of time. And so their advice to the Chartists was stop with all these petitions and strikes for the charter, in other words, for the vote, for the universal suffrage. And you should actually start founding colonies of workers working together in a socialist manner, which can then spread and transform society. And so when Marx is talking about the communists not standing opposed to other working class parties, I am certain that they were having this example, they had this example in mind. Marx and Engels worked with and collaborated with the Chartists. They understood the significance of what Chartism represented. And so they were thinking of these underground secret societies that would try to launch insurrections over the head of the working class without first winning the workers and the masses. They were thinking about these kind of these figures who would write a book with a blueprint basically for a future society and then just lecture the workers on how, well, if you just do this, then you can have socialism. That has never worked. What they're saying is that the communists must be an active part of the workers' movement as a whole. It doesn't mean they have to dissolve themselves into whatever parties existed at that time. They obviously have their own program. And here's the other element, that the communists always stand for, first of all, the interests of the world working class. They don't succumb to a national narrowness of just thinking, well, it would be better. For instance, on the question of colonialism, you had English socialists who were basically saying that, well, it's in the interest of the English working class to continue exploiting India. Therefore, let's just try to get more of the proceeds from that for the English workers. Marx and Engels never supported that idea. They always point to the interests of the working class as a whole, but also the end point of the movement. So whilst participating in any struggle of the workers, the struggle for the vote, the struggle for higher wages, none of these things equate to socialism. But Marx and Engels were very explicit from the beginning that communists fight side by side with the workers' movement as it actually exists, not as we'd like it to be, not as we hope it's going to be in 20 years or whatever, but as it actually exists now, to fight for the workers alongside, fight alongside the workers as part of their struggle for any improvement they can win, but also pointing the way forward. That is in contrast with reformists and opportunists who will only ever put forward the immediate interests. Let's tax the rich a bit more, and that's that. And then, that'll do us. To basically lull the workers and the most advanced section of the workers into thinking that it's possible to gradually transform capitalism. This is really what they're getting at, that the communists are part of the movement, but they're the most advanced part of the movement and should not lose sight of that.
And what's really instructive is not only are they saying the communists are the most advanced part, they say they are guided by a theory. They're grounded in a broader perspective. And they say that's an advantage they have over even the most courageous and advanced and radical layers of the working class that lack that theoretical grounding because they know where they're going. They have a broader view of history. They know what the end goal has to be. And I mean, that's something that we often say, right? In our organization, we're a relatively small organization, our justification for existence is our ideas. It's the revolutionary program, the Marxist program that we convey into the movement or towards the advanced layers of workers and youth.
It reminds me of what Lenin said: without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement.
Yeah, exactly. So, one of the other most famous passages from the manifesto, Marx and Engels say that the theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. And what follows, one of my favorite parts of the book, is this kind of imaginary dialogue with their critics. You know, they're basically paraphrasing the attacks they were receiving daily from the ruling class and their mouthpieces. And it's things like, oh, you want to take away my hard-won property that I've earned, that I deserve. And they say, oh, you want to make people lazy. If you take away capitalism, then people just won't work and they'll just lie about doing nothing. So, oh, you want to take over my family. You want to you want to socialize our wives. These are all the same sorts of arguments that I know that you've heard.
Yeah.
I know that I've heard, and I'm sure if you're in any way organized on the left, you've heard as well, watching this podcast and listening to this podcast. These are the same arguments. In a way, it's kind of gratifying to know that our enemies have not been able to come up with an original criticism of communism in going on 150, 180 years. So let's first of all deal with the statement on its face. What do Marx and Engels mean by the idea that our theory could be summed up in the sentence, abolition of private property?
Yeah, first of all, so communism, the word communism, comes from this idea of common goods. All goods to be held in common. So there were communists before Marx and Engels, and they would talk about how basically everything was going to be held in common. Marx and Engels took that up and clarified it a bit, because one thing that I often hear is, well, does that mean that just everything, all of our possessions, like my toothbrush, or, you know, I'm playing my PlayStation one day and someone could just take it? That's not really what anyone means by communism, but that's certainly not what Marx and Engels meant by communism. When they say, and they clarify this in the book, when they say abolition of private property, they mean bourgeois private property, the private ownership of the means of production. Means of production, of course, being the factories, the machinery, the banks, the things that are used in order to produce. Under capitalism, as we know, individuals, companies, again with individual shareholders, own all of the means of production, almost all of the means of production on the planet. To sum up the theory of the communists, that becomes impossible. Instead, the means of production are held and exploited collectively in a planned way. Therefore, it does, and they say this explicitly, it does not remove the right of workers and individuals to appropriate the products of labour. In other words, to go to the supermarket and buy a meal that then can't simply be repossessed by, you know, the communist order or by other people. But what they do get rid of is the right for any individual to own the social productive forces, the social means of production, and to exploit other people as property. That's what abolition of private property means here.
Yeah, and just to summarise it, or that point in Marx and Engels' own words, when therefore capital is converted into common property, into the property of all members of society, personal property is not thereby transformed into social property. It is only the social character of the property that has changed. It loses its class character. So this is the point. It's not that suddenly it's the party's toothbrush. The point is that the social character of property as such, and most importantly, the defining means of production that are the private property of the capitalists, lose that social character and they become the property of society and run for the benefit of society. I mean, should we get into some of these specific slanders from the bourgeois about?
Sure. And just to reiterate what you said, that it's so amazing that in the wild, you know, in the world outside this studio, I have heard, as you said, every single one of these arguments put to me, and honestly as well. It's really phenomenal, and the response given is fantastic. The one that I hear a lot is, well, the one about laziness is extremely common. Well, if the needs of life are provided by society, if you cannot hope to become a billionaire or become a capitalist and exploit people, then you're not going to work hard. And the response that Marx and Engels give is, well, if that were the case, then capitalism would have gone to the dogs long ago.
Yes.
Because the people who do all the work get nothing. The working class get nothing back. They get the bare means of subsistence. And the people who own everything do no work.
Just to highlight that point, Elon Musk is very proud of the hundreds of hours he's sunk into Dark Souls and Dota 2. Some of that apparently is paying youngsters in India to play for him, but nevertheless,
really? Okay.
he makes a big deal about how much time he spends playing video games while presumably, fleets of workers are toiling away in Tesla, actually building things.
And how many members of the ruling class are not even, I mean, whether you can really call what Musk does work, bear in mind he's basically just fulfilling his hobby and his own inflated sense of self, running around
tweeting 10,000 times a day.
Meanwhile, all of his engineering innovation is done by a team of wage workers, basically employed engineers. But I mean, at least he is running a company. I don't want to present myself as a defender of Elon Musk, but by capitalist standards, he's doing something. But I would say probably the majority of the ruling class today are made up of what Engels called coupon clippers. Basically, people who are either the relatives or have inherited wealth from the bourgeois of the past, or people who basically invested in one of these massive corporations and now just receive dividends or some trust fund. So they play literally no role in production whatsoever. Even directing employees, they're not doing anything, which makes them a very, I would say, close parallel to the old aristocracy back in the 18th century. These landlords that played no role in production whatsoever except to take rents and tithes and so on. That's the position that our ruling class is in today. And so this whole thing about laziness is completely hypocritical. The people, as Marx and Engels say, the people who are working hardest are the people that tend to get least. There are people today who are working 3 jobs simply to pay rent and a bit of food, basically. And I suppose what the capitalists would say is, well, they're incentivized by poverty. They need that to survive. I think that tells you everything you need to know about the capitalists, that they see these workers as simply beasts of burden who have to be driven with the stick of poverty in order to produce, to do what? To make them immense profits.
Yes. And this point about communists, to use the terms of the manifesto, introducing the community of women and socializing the family, Marx and Engels have the best possible reply to this. They say, okay, the bourgeoisie here, they want to abolish private property, and immediately say, you're trying to socialize my wife. And they say, oh, so you regard your wife as private property. Yeah. You regard your wife as an instrument of production. Property. I mean, what more can you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And under capitalism, they are. Under capitalism, women still, even though the women's movement and women's rights have progressed, have made gains since Marx and Engels' day, I think we'd have to acknowledge that. In no small part because of the growth of the working class, by the way, and the birth of of working class women, the emergence of working class women as a major factor in society. But that's to go slightly beyond the bounds of this discussion. In the bourgeois family that Marx and Engels talk about, the wives of the bourgeoisie were not allowed to work, were basically instruments for reproduction. Trophy wives for the production and rearing of children who were not allowed to play any role in society. Of course, they weren't allowed to vote. They were treated simply as commodities almost to be bought and sold. And then they complain, as you've already pointed out, they complain that, oh, well, if they're going to nationalise all property, they must mean my wife as well because she's property. And actually, this has been the case throughout class society, that women have been treated as the property of men. Communism abolishes that. That's what the so-called community of women means, the liberation of women, that women cease to be treated as property and second-class citizens and actually are fully independent, equal individuals with everybody else. Yeah,
and if that's the charge, then we communists plead guilty. Yeah. And just another to touch on, which we don't have time to expand on because it's a whole other episode, but the internationalism implicit in Marxism and in genuine communism. They talk about the charge from the bourgeois that communists seek to abolish countries and nationality. And Marx and Engels reply, the working class have no country. We can't take from them what they've not got. And they talk about national antagonisms more and more vanishing, actually, to a certain extent, under capitalism, because of the way that capitalism and the world market kind of dissolve everything into their logic. Obviously, national antagonisms and differences still exist, and they still play an important role under capitalism today. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on this point about the working class of the world having no nation.
Well, yeah, this is a very interesting point. Marx and Engels here aren't denying that nations exist, obviously. And they're not denying that the class struggle takes place within certain nations. In the same book, they say that first of all, the working class settles accounts with its own national bourgeoisie. So then, well, is that a contradiction then? What do they mean by the working class has no nation? What they mean is that capitalism itself has become increasingly global. Marx and Engels are talking about, the bourgeoisie establishing connections everywhere, globalization effectively as early as the 1840s. It's even more pronounced today. The economy is more and more integrated, and the conditions of life and the interests of the workers of all countries are pretty much identical. The way that the working class is exploited is identical. The kind of conditions that they face, you have variations, of course, you have richer and poorer countries, but they are broadly the same. And the interest the workers have in collectively organizing and using their power in the economy to strike, for instance, to form political parties and to struggle to overthrow capitalist oppression is common to all countries. And you see this, you look at the history of the labour movement, the history of any country basically, and you look for the working class element, because often it's hidden by official historians, but you look hard enough, and it's not that hard, you will see the same process, obviously with different national forms, but the same process. And not only that, but the workers have an interest in supporting each other's struggles. That a strike of workers in one country can be broken sometimes by other workers being prepared to scab or unload boats. We've seen, haven't we? We've even had solidarity strikes with the Palestine movement in Italy, and workers refusing to load ships with arms for Israel and stuff like that. It shows the potential of the working class. So to summarize what I mean, first of all, it's a recognition that the working class needs to overthrow capitalism internationally. Capitalism is an international global system, so it's not sufficient to simply overthrow the bourgeoisie at home. Therefore, the working class has an objective interest in fighting on an international scale, but also the workers, irrespective of whether they've read Marx and Engels, recognize that those common interests. And so many times in history, not all the time, not every day, but many times in history, you see workers' movements in different countries linking up because of that recognition.
Mm-hmm. There's also a point in this chapter where Marx and Engels talk about the relationship between man's consciousness and his social conditions. They say that man's ideas, views, and conception, in one word, man's consciousness, changes with every change in the conditions of his material existence in his social relations and his social life. This is something that you actually delved into in a bit more detail in the last season's episode about what Karl Marx really stood for. I'll link that in the description. But can you give just a bit of a telegraphic summary of what Marx and Engels are driving at here? Because it's a very important point.
Well, yeah, it's not every day you're reading a political manifesto and all of a sudden one of the most profound statements of philosophy just leaps out at you.
Dropped in your lap.
I haven't got that from reading the Labour Manifesto in any time. But yeah, what Marx is saying is that human beings are conscious. We have minds. We have ideas, but we live in a material environment, and that material environment is shaped not only by geography and climate, but also by the social relations, technological development, the social edifice that has been constructed around us. Mm-hmm. And as society has evolved, and as we were talking about in relation to chapter 1, that social evolution is not determined by people's ideas about, I think actually society should be run this way. It's actually the other way around, that as production has developed and new relations have emerged, in order to produce the needs, the means to satisfy the needs of humanity, new ideas have emerged reflecting that reality. In other words, what I'm trying to get at, Marx and Engels are materialist philosophers. That means that matter is primary and ideas secondary. Ideas ultimately just reflect our material reality. Yes, we can act on ideas and therefore react back on our material surroundings. It's not simply a one-way passive process, but that our ideas are reflections of our material reality. And as I mentioned, our material reality includes our social, the material foundation of our society. This is an incredibly profound and revolutionary statement, as I think I touched on earlier, that historians up until this point saw history as nothing other than either a succession of ideas or the realization of one or several eternal ideas for all time, just becoming more and more liberal, for instance, or getting to a purer and more perfect conception of Christianity, or whatever it is that you're looking at history from. What I think Marx and Engels here are saying, that the outlook, the ideas, the philosophy, the religions, the moral ideas of human beings have changed over time, which is undeniable. And what's driven that change has been the changes in our material surroundings, including the class struggle and the new classes that emerged. And that comes to this powerful conclusion that all of these objections to communism that we've just talked about are not, they are reflections of a specific class interest. They're not speaking on the part of humanity as a whole or objective reason. What they're talking about is when they talk about property as a whole or laziness as a whole or the community of women, family as a whole, the individual, they're looking at it from a specifically bourgeois point of view. I just want to take up this question of the individual. I think one of the most common objections to communism that I've heard is that under communism, individuals are just a number, basically, and you wouldn't have any individual freedom or development. I mean, how many times have you heard the word freedom in the bourgeois press, from the libertarians? They abuse the term. What does freedom mean to a capitalist? Freedom is freedom to exploit.
Yes.
To do whatever he wants, to whomever he wants. And that applies to the scandals around the so-called Epstein class. The freedom basically to be free of any control of society and to dominate. That is freedom under capitalism. And the freedom of the worker is the freedom to choose which slave master you're going to work for or which bridge you're going to sleep under. Mm-hmm. That's freedom under capitalism. And so when they say the communists want to abolish freedom, and likewise, they want to abolish the individual or constrain the individual, what is the individual to Elon Musk? There's only really one real individual, and it's Elon Musk. And the development of the individual means the development and wealth and happiness of Elon Musk and his class. So when they accuse communists of wanting to abolish the individual or enslave the individual, reduce the individual to a number, abolish freedom and all this kind of stuff, really what they're talking about is they want to abolish their freedom to be these kind of all-powerful individuals. And to that, Marx and Engels say guilty as charged. But it's precisely in getting rid of this sham freedom of capitalism that you can finally have the real, the full and free development of individuals. I love how in the book they say that communism is where the development of each, in other words, the genuine development of the individual to educate themselves, to develop new skills, to have the necessities of life provided, that free development of each individual contributes to the development of all. It shows the narrowness of the bourgeois conception, and this is why they introduce this profound idea at this point in the book.
All right. Well, just to conclude this chapter, there are a series of programmatic demands that are put forward, but I would point out that there's an important caveat that Marx and Engels added in their 1872 preface. And on the surface of it, some of these demands, I mean, abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes, heavy progressive or graduated income tax, abolition of all rights of inheritance, none of these sound like socialism. They don't sound terribly radical. So what exactly were Marx and Engels getting at with this list of demands, and what is the caveat they put in place?
So the point that Marx and Engels stress is that the aim of the communists and the aim of the workers' movement is the seizure of power by the working class. The working class becomes the ruling class. And then when they provide a list of demands, they're very careful to make it clear that they're not setting out a cookbook for a future society. Mm-hmm. This was a really live issue in the 1840s. There were many different sects who were setting out, even how you would arrange housing, like planning places for people to live and what jobs they'd all do, like planning in detail what the future society is supposed to look like. Marx and Engels resisted that very forcefully. And so their whole point here is that the emancipation of the working class and the realization of communism is the task of the working class itself. We have seen this development, this evolution, the production of the working class. Marx and Engels have come to the conclusion, presented, I would say, an extremely compelling argument that the direction of history is towards the downfall of the capitalist class and capitalism and the victory of the working class. And the task of the communists is to make that to make that clear to the most advanced section of the working class, as whilst fighting alongside them. Therefore, the program just reflects that reality, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. It talks about the working class winning the battle of democracy. That strikes me as a slightly odd term today. That's because it must be remembered that at this time in 1847, there's only one working class party on earth, and the working class, of course, have never seized power anywhere. They've had movements in isolated cities and so on, but the working class taking power in any country for any given period of time is unknown. The only mass political movement of the working class that had existed up until that point really was Chartism, which was a struggle for what? For universal suffrage, with the idea that the workers, as the majority of the population, would put a workers' party into government, and that party then, in Marx and Engels' eyes, would abolish the monarchy, the House of Lords would transform society. It wouldn't be just tampering with the capitalist system for the benefit of the workers. So the key thing in this idea of the battle democracy is the seizure of power by the working class becoming the ruling class. And this actually is clarified even further by Marx and Engels. In 1850, after the experience of 1848, they used the term, which is probably quite well known in Marxism now, the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's what that means. It means the working class becomes the ruling class. It doesn't just form a government in a bourgeois republic or a bourgeois constitutional monarchy. It is the ruling class running society in its interests. This conception of the dictatorship of the proletariat then becomes even clearer after the experience of the Paris Commune, where finally the working class does take power, not in the whole of France, but in one of the biggest cities in the world, and begins only for a few months, but begins running society without the bosses, before the Commune is brutally crushed by the ruling class. Again, showing this real method of Marxism, rather than just saying, well, the dictatorship of the proletariat is this, that, and the other because I've deduced that from the logical necessity of communism. Marx and Engels are constantly enriching their idea of what communism would look like, what the class rule of the working class should look like, based on what the workers' movement is actually doing. First, they draw on Chartism. Then they draw on the experience of 1848. Then they continue to draw on other movements, but 1871 is pivotal in that now they've seen the workers in power, just for a short window, but they've actually seen what it looks like. Marx explicitly said this is the dictatorship of the proletariat in action. And so this actually causes them to introduce one of the very, very few corrections, if you like. I mentioned the footnote about the history of class society and when that emerged, but this is another important correction that Marx and Engels thought fit to add to the manifesto. They didn't doctor the text, which I think is a very good thing. Marx and Engels said it's become something of a historical document now. We don't want to tamper with the text, because if we did, there'd be so many little things that we could change. Then what would be the point? Instead, they introduce a preface in 1872, which you mentioned earlier, in which it says that the Paris Commune has shown that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the already existing state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. What that means is this battle of democracy, which is referred to in the Communist Manifesto, does not mean the workers elect a government which then governs with the same state bureaucracy, the same military, the bourgeois state, right? That is not made explicitly clear in the manifesto. That was something that was clarified by experience. Marx and Engels always thought that the working class should become a ruling class, but what that actually looks like was not something they just sucked out of their thumb. It was something that came from the movement. And finally, you can also see that in the demands. The specific demands were drawn directly from the existing workers' movement, which relates back to this thing about the communists not being some separate force opposed to the rest of the working class. It's Marx and Engels being true to their word, if you like.
Yes.
But obviously what they were taking was the most advanced demands,
right.
Things like nationalising all of the land and developing an economic plan, more state-owned enterprises. This is obviously a very, very advanced expression of the workers' movement at the time. But again, that is the role of communists, isn't it?
Yeah, and in that same preface, they say that the practical application of the principles in the manifesto will depend everywhere and at all times on the historical conditions for the time being existing, and so no special stress is laid on the measures proposed at the end of chapter 2. And they say that they would have presented very different demands had they written the manifesto even in 1872. So I think it's important that we clarify that that's not a part of the text which is sort of written on tablets of stone from Mount Sinai. Right.
And just to add to that, Marx did participate in the drafting of a new manifesto for the French Workers' Party, so the French Marxist Party in 1880, where they do take up more demands. I'm not going to list them here, but they go in some cases further than the manifesto. They talk about the abolition of the standing army. This is drawn by the experience of the Commune. Abolition of the standing army and general arming of the people. The Commune to be master of its administration and its police. What that means is that basically the police become like council workers In Britain, they're called local authorities. The commune was basically a local council. So the abolition of the police as a separate standing force, you can see the progressive significance of that demand, thinking of recent movements like BLM, and the police are basically just accountable officials of the local council. But then you also have economic demands that were, again, just taken directly from the workers' movement. Things like the 8-hour day, so limitation of working hours, increase of the minimum wage, progressive taxation. Marx and Engels didn't scoff at the idea of taxation of the rich, but this was always combined with demands that led the working class to the conquest of power. So just to give give a bit of a concrete example of what kind of demands Marx and Engels were putting forward later on.
Okay, let's move into chapter 3, Socialist and Communist Literature. So this is where Marx and Engels basically position themselves in relation to other thinkers, philosophers in the communist and socialist tradition of their day, and also a little bit before them, and they go through them one by one, and I think we should follow the same order that they do. So they begin by talking about this broad category of reactionary socialism, the first of which they call feudal socialism. So what exactly is feudal, or perhaps I should say was, feudal socialism?
Before I get into feudal socialism, one thing I want to explain is, what do we mean by reactionary? Maybe many of the viewers and listeners are already familiar with this term, but one thing I found is kind of outside the Marxist movement, this term is not very well known, and so when I describe something as reactionary, they tend to think it means like a knee-jerk reaction, like it's responding to something. And in a way, reaction in this sense is reacting to something, but it's reacting to revolution and progress. So when we talk about a reactionary, we mean a counter-revolutionary. Someone is trying to turn back the wheel of time, or the wheel of history. And so reactionary socialism, is that not a contradiction in terms, people might be thinking? In what way can you have a socialist who's also reactionary? What that means is somebody whose conception of socialism means actually harking back to an image of the past. It's this, a reactionary wants to turn the wheel of history backwards. And so feudal socialism, which I think is probably an example of one of the trends talked about in the manifesto that isn't present today. I'm struggling to think of a real example of feudal socialism. It was a real phenomenon in Marx and Engels' era. It was made up of, so for instance, in England, members of the Tory party. The Tory party was the party of the landed aristocracy in particular. Now it's party of the bourgeoisie. But back in that time, you still had this division between the old landed aristocracy, which was still subservient to the capitalist order, but they existed, and then the liberal industrial capitalists. The liberal industrial capitalists tended to be fond of things like free trade and so on. The landed aristocracy was in favour of controlling prices for things like corn, wheat, because that's how they would make their money and their rents. And so in the 1840s, there was a bitter struggle going on between these two different wings of the ruling class. The liberal manufacturing bourgeoisie was becoming more and more rich and powerful, and a section of the aristocracy, the landed aristocracy and its representatives, started attacking the very real evils of capitalist exploitation. They felt threatened, and so they were saying, you factory owners, you are treating your workers, you're subjecting them to conditions of semi-slavery, you're forcing women to work 14-hour days in mines, you're making children work in appalling conditions with no education, all of which was true. But of course, they were talking about it from their own class interests. So this phenomenon of feudal socialism was often trends. Marx and Engels talks about the Young England trend of basically Tories who were taking up, and I'm sure these individuals probably were quite genuine, at least some of them were very genuine, saying that capitalist exploitation was against the principles of the Bible and so on, and that actually what we need is a brotherhood of man. But in reality, this conception of a brotherhood of man was a highly romanticized picture of the old, like, rural village lifestyle in which the Lord is kind of the father of his people. So reactionary in that it is looking backwards and also impossible. And not really the genuine interest of the working class. It's not really in the genuine interest of the working class to be subjected to the domination of the landed aristocracy again, as in the past. And so it was a bit, looking back now, it seems like historical curiosity, but this was a genuine, real part in the movement. We shouldn't underestimate its influence, because often Marx and Engels at the end of this section talk about how they describe Christian socialism as another wing, if you like, of feudal socialism. this raises a very interesting point today, because there is such a thing as Christian socialism today. Would we characterize it as feudal socialism? In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels say how the Christian socialists are basically just the handmaidens of the landed aristocracy. Well, considering that landed aristocracy basically doesn't exist now, I would say that Christian socialism today cannot really be described as feudal. In reality, Christian socialism, as it exists, will tend to express the interests and the outlook of classes that exist today. So I've encountered Christian socialists who really just want a kind of gentler form of capitalism and really just are justifying capitalism in certain language. I've also seen Christian socialists like liberation theology, which are reflecting the anti-colonial struggle and the struggle of the peasantry. I wouldn't say they're advocating feudalism. It's not communism as we understand it, but yeah, it's a different form to what Marx and Engels is talking about, just as a minor point of clarification. So yeah, feudal socialism is something that I would say has died out now.
Okay, so if feudal socialism is type 1A, if you like, it's the first subcategory of reactionary socialism, then type 1B is petty bourgeois socialism. So what is petty bourgeois socialism?
Petty bourgeois socialism is, again, a genuine attack on the capitalist order and on the domination of the capitalists and the exploitation of the capitalists. Again, in the name of society as a whole, in the name of humanity as a whole, but reflecting the peculiar class interests of this class I was talking about previously, the shop owners, the small craftsmen and so on, a class that has been destroyed by capitalism. So similar to this is why they're all included in reactionary socialism, because these are classes that are actually passing out of the stage of history. The landed aristocracy is simply being consumed by the bourgeoisie. The petty bourgeois is being torn apart by the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, driven out of business. And so the representatives, the kind of theoretical representatives of the petty bourgeoisie, talked about placing limits on basically this horrendous exploitation by capitalism. And so what Marx criticizes these people from, I think he includes Sismondi in the camp of petty bourgeois socialism, is that he credits them with discovering and pointing out the genuine evils of capitalism, but thinking that it's possible to overcome those evils by simply placing harsh limits on the expansion of capitalist production, so that you have this mass of small producers, often relying on a completely false, idealized picture of what the society of the past looked like. You know, when you had guild production, everyone was okay, everyone was able to get by. It's kind of a bit of a fantasy, a reactionary fantasy, because of course it's fantasizing about a past state of affairs. And again, similar to feudal socialism, it's impossible. The whole logic of capitalist development is towards a concentration of wealth. And therefore, petty bourgeois socialism proves to be both reactionary and utopian in the sense that it's impossible. And therefore, Marx and Engels are pointing out that this is not the way forward for the working class, even if it does espouse certain socialist ideas. Okay,
and type 1C, they call German or true socialism. So what's this?
This one is especially peculiar. Again, this was something that Marx and Engels had to take up in the manifesto. This is a manifesto of the Communist League, which is a German revolutionary organization, where some of the ideas of this true German socialism were very prevalent. So again, it comes across as a curiosity reading it today, but it was an essential part of the document at the time. And what the trend they're talking about was an offshoot, really, of the utopian socialist trend that we're going to talk about in a moment, that emerged in France in particular. So you had these socialist theorists who identified the evils of capitalism, who also identified, we're quite far-sighted in some ways in identifying the need for more collective organization of production, that they saw that capitalist competition was one of the key evils in society. And they also saw the pauperization of a large section of the population. In the 1830s and 40s, you had a major problem of homelessness, of pauperization of workers and peasants flooding into the cities. And so people living at this time, intellectuals living at this time, did have a lot to say about this issue. And anyway, in France, which of course had a revolution against the absolutist monarchy, had certain traditions of republicanism, you had these theorists that were talking about various different socialist projects. These documents were eagerly read and translated into German and eagerly read by Germans at the time. But Marx and Engels make a very profound observation that Germany has not gone through the same historical experience as France. The class balance of forces in Germany is very, very different. the bourgeoisie is weaker, the working class is much smaller and weaker. Something like the French Revolution of the late 18th century had not occurred in Germany. It still had an absolutist monarchy in many of the German states, or these kind of like pathetic, really tiny duchies and so on. And what's more, actually, the kind of respectable German society, the German bourgeoisie, was actually horrified by the French Revolution. And the French Revolutionary Wars, which of course then in the Napoleonic Wars affected Germany, swept over Germany. And so you started having these German theorists that they didn't just translate these socialist ideas into the language of German, they translated it into the German philosophy of the time, translating it into Hegelian language, and also trying to clear it up of any of this nasty class struggle business. All talk about revolutions by force and so on. We've had quite enough of that. The German people don't need that kind of thing. It reminds me a bit when English people say, oh, we had our revolution in the 17th century, don't need one of those again, so therefore we can have just a gradual passage to socialism or whatever. And so you had these, charlatans, really, I have to say. People like Karl who would copy ideas of French socialists, people like Proudhon, people like Saint-Simon, write it in German, proclaim it as their own unique theory. Often these would portray themselves as messianic individuals. And the key thing, anyway, to summarize, we don't need to spend too long on this. The point here is that all of these theories reject the struggle of the working class for power. The so-called true German socialists spoke in the name of society as a whole. They sometimes would advocate insurrection in some cases, but it was always some charismatic messianic leader leading the people as a whole, rather than the conscious organization of the workers and the seizure of power. And usually it would involve some powerful religious element, such as the League of the Just that we were talking about earlier. And so it was often selling, it was quite influential in these German populations in cities across Europe at the time. And so Marx and Engels were having to combat these ideas, which were really, it was like snake oil salesmen selling an easy option, like, oh, well, if you just follow me. And at one point, one of them, Karl, Wilhelm Weitling, was talking about leading an invasion of Germany, that these German workers would simply just cross the border, arms in hand, and invade Germany. And these kind of utopian schemes were a distraction, frankly, one that Marx and Engels saw it as the task of communists to dispel. But true German socialism in that sense does not exist. You still have these kind of charismatic individuals, snake oil salesmen of all kinds, but not specifically of this kind of true German socialist kind.
Okay, well, moving into type 2, by the way, I'm not quoting directly when I give this sort of typology from the text. This is just me to help the viewer and listener. Type 2, bourgeois socialism, starts to feel a little bit closer to home.
Yeah. And this is one part of this section which is highly relevant today. Perhaps even more relevant today than when it was written, considering this kind of confusion of other trends that existed at the time. Bourgeois socialism is our representatives, sometimes calling themselves socialists, not always call themselves socialists, who basically wanted to, they would come up with various reforms and schemes to eliminate the evils that exist under capitalism, such as homelessness, for instance, by administrative measures, such as increasing taxes, or by various clever schemes that would crucially retain the market economy, retain commodity production. In other words, the material foundation of capitalism would be preserved. Capitalism itself really would be preserved, but it would somehow be turned into, today we hear about capitalism with a human face, or human capitalism. And there's a great variety of people who fall into this camp. Marx explicitly mentions Proudhon. That might strike readers as surprising. Proudhon is known as one of the fathers of anarchism. He talked about revolution at times. At one point he said, I am the revolution. Not sure what he meant by that, but I think he was suggesting he was in favor of some kind of revolution. But the reason that Marx includes Proudhon in the camp of bourgeois socialism, even though you might think, oh, he's for the overthrow of capitalism, is because Proudhon was explicitly against revolutionary uprisings. He made that very, very clear. What he wanted was a social revolution in which the workers would form mutual societies and cooperatives, which would produce and trade on the market. But if the cooperatives sold at, what he thought was the value, basically sold at cost and didn't make a profit, then there'd be no exploitation and everyone would be better off. Of course, those cooperatives would collapse. And so really what he was talking about is preserving commodity production, but having the workers exploit themselves. And so Marx criticised him very sharply for actually wanting to retain capitalism but do away with the evils of capitalism. There's this wonderful line in the book where it says, the bourgeois socialists want a bourgeoisie without a proletariat. They don't like the poverty, they don't like the misery of the proletariat, so they just want to get rid of that while retaining what they see as the good aspects of capitalism. And I'm sure people listening today can think of many, many examples today. It's reformism.
Yes.
It's somebody who says, democratic socialism, often, it's not always given that name, but somebody who says, yes, I want to eliminate homelessness, and what we're going to do is tax the rich a bit more and then build social housing, which, by the way, I would support that.
Oh, yeah, of course.
But the idea that you can actually get rid of the problems of capitalism by these small administrative measures whilst retaining the foundation of the whole system, Bernie Sanders saying, the banks are too powerful, we're going to break up the banks, and then what do we think is going to happen? So you've got capitalism, the role of banks are exactly the same. They're obviously going to consolidate into greater banks. So I would say that this bourgeois socialist trend, is by far the most prominent today. Not only out of the trends detailed in this book, but it's probably still the most powerful trend in the workers' movement today, against which communists have to struggle.
Yeah. Summarised at the end of this part in the phrase, the bourgeois is a bourgeois for the benefit of the working class. So
yes.
The capitalists work for you.
Exactly, and that just reminds me, sorry to go on, but that just reminds me, during the run-up to the Brexit referendum in Britain,
Oh, don't remind me.
both sides, both the Leave and Remain sides, were appealing to the working class, who are the majority of the electorate, saying, oh, if we break free from the European Union, there are going to be much better jobs, we're going to get all these trade deals, we're going to bring back industry to the Rust Belt areas, like around Sunderland and so on. Meanwhile, the Remainers were saying the EU protects workers' rights, and it's better for British capitalism. So if British capitalism makes more money as a result of being in this trade deal, then the workers are better off, aren't they? These arguments were explicitly made. And not only by people like the Tory government, who aren't bourgeois socialists, they're just bourgeois politicians, but even so-called socialists within Labour Party, within the Corbyn movement, which was, very prominent at the time, they were, with a straight face, they were making these arguments, talking about a left Remain, a socialist Remain vote. I remember when I was rereading the manifesto at that time, thinking, this is absolutely spot on, Marx's analysis.
Quite. And finally, type 3, critical utopian socialism and communism. I have to say, this feels like the trend that Marx and Engels are kindest towards, while still criticising.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Marx and Engels actually had a lot of respect for many of these people, perhaps not all. It was actually by reading people like Saint-Simon and Fourier, who were French socialists of this critical utopian trend, that Marx and Engels developed their own ideas about communism. As we've said already, they didn't just suck these ideas out their thumb. And what Marx and Engels credit these individuals with doing, by the way, these individuals were writing in the beginning of the 19th century. They're not writing in the 1840s. They've already died by this point, and their followers are a prominent trend in the movement. Marx and Engels credit these individuals with identifying not only the evils, but some of the actual logic of capitalism itself. This amazing idea in chapter 1 of the manifesto, that society has passed through stages and that capitalism is simply one stage and that there's going to be another stage. They put forward that idea before Marx and Engels. Ironically, Saint-Simon didn't use the word socialism. He didn't talk about socialism. But what he did talk about, he called it industrial society. So writing in something like 1802, when there wasn't very much industry to talk about, he managed to identify that the tendency of the future was the development of more and more industry, more and more planning, the use of technology more to plan and develop the economy. He was absolutely right. He saw that as a progressive thing. And so what he said was that society should be industry should be scientifically planned for the benefit of all. That's why people call him a socialist. He never called himself a socialist. His followers later coined the term socialism, but he never did. The problem is, and Marx and Engels also identify this, that at this time, the working class barely existed anywhere outside Britain. And even in Britain, it was much weaker than in the 1840s. The factory system was only really barely coming into being. The Industrial Revolution was taking off, but modern factories, less so. And so these kind of prophetic statements were mixed up with very mystical elements. Saint-Simon also talked about a new stage in Christianity and kind of trying to find a new Messiah and all this kind of stuff. But also, because the working class was so weak, this idea of a planned, scientifically planned economy was something to be done by the capitalists. So what Saint-Simon actually coined the term working class. But for the working class for Saint-Simon included the factory owners and the bankers, because he was counterposing the factory owners, the bankers, and the real workers and peasants to the idle aristocracy in the church that didn't do anything but still got rents and tithes. In other words, it was a very confused picture. In reality, he was presenting an idealized picture of the future of capitalism, not of socialism. But because he talked about planning, and he talked about for the benefit of all, not just for the ruling class, and he also put forward an extremely profound idea, which is contained also in the manifesto, but Saint-Simon put it forward first, that, well, if the state arose as basically a means of oppressing, as a parasitic growth on society, and that under this, in a planned industrial society, the state would be redundant, and so it would wither away, basically. Marx and Engels picked up, they developed this idea further in the manifesto. You'll see it. It talks about how the state is actually an instrument of oppression of one class by another. It exists necessarily because of class society. And so if the working class take over the means of production and plan the production scientifically in a communist society, the state will wither away. So you can see the influence of Saint-Simon, but also the limitations. Now, another side of this was also, Saint-Simon wasn't so much like this, but other utopians such as Charles Fourier, again, he wrote very wittily, very sharply about the evils and the contradictions of capitalism. Fourier also talked about how capitalism is just a stage in civilization, and then be another stage, which he called socialism. But for him, socialism was the establishment of what he called phalanstères, basically large buildings, if you like, housing blocks, with exactly 1,600 people living them, with farms attached, where the different tasks to be carried out by the community would be allocated on a rota basis so that everyone could get experience doing things. In other words, a picture of socialism where he quite literally drew a blueprint, like an architectural sketch of what the future society should look like. And you can understand the limitations of that, that that's not how society works. That's certainly not Marx and Engels' conception. And then you had other people, I won't go into detail about the others, but you had other people who talked about going off to the United States, where of course, at this time you had, settlement, obviously pushing out the indigenous population, but European settlers founding agricultural settlements in the Midwest. And so you had a lot of socialists, French socialists, who literally got together with hundreds of people, moved out to America and founded their socialist colonies. And as I'm sure it won't be a surprise to hear, they weren't successful. And so Marx and Engels are giving credit to the enormous influence of some of these ideas, particularly Saint-Simon and Fourier. They also included Owen. I mentioned Owen previously, but obviously I mentioned the limitations there, but Owen was one of the first to point out the redundancy of the capitalist class. He noticed the rate of growth under capitalism. He noticed that the workers were producing all that growth. Owen himself was a factory owner, by the way. He was a bourgeois and a factory owner. He realized that the workers were producing all the wealth, that the wealth of society was being multiplied time and time again, but the workers' conditions were more or less the same. And he asked, why is that? And so he actually he set up his factory to be much more pro-worker, basically. The conditions of the workers in his factory are much better than anywhere else. And he put forward the idea, well, what if the workers just produce themselves? The limitations, and he, as I mentioned, he participated in the foundation of the first ever national union in Britain. So he played an important and progressive role. However, his vision of socialism is that, you set up these socialist colonies. You go to America, you set up places called the New Jerusalem. You basically try to set up factories and communes of workers working in isolation, detached from the rest of society. And of course, these experiments failed. They went bankrupt and were just absorbed back into capitalist society. This was not how the new stage in society was going to be established. But yes, Marx and Engels did give a lot of credit, actually, to these pioneers of the socialist movement.
Yeah, I mean, they basically say the tragedy of these people is that they had ideas in advance of the development of the class struggle of their day.
Yeah.
Before we end this chapter, I want to jump to a point that Engels brings out in the 1888 English edition preface to the Communist Manifesto. So this is after Marx's death, and he talks about why they called themselves communists as opposed to socialists. And he says basically that the adherents to the utopian school of socialism, the Owenites in England, the Fourierists in France, and so on, had already kind of had their day, and they'd already become a bit passé, and they called themselves socialist. And the term socialism was associated with basically pencil necks and intellectuals, and it was seen as more of a an academic term, whereas communist had a bit of proletarian cachet. It was associated more with the working class. So they deliberately adopted this name in order to connect themselves more and identify themselves more with the working class. And I wanted to bring that out because that feels relevant to some of the experiences that we've even had in our organization in the last couple of years, where we're finding that the experience of the betrayals and the limitations of left reformism of people who describe themselves as socialist, like Bernie Sanders, you mentioned previously, Jeremy Corbyn in the UK as well. You know, people who amassed a big following by talking about socialism and enthused and inspired lots of people, especially young people, but then in one way or another betrayed or capitulated and weren't prepared to go far enough. And for a significant layer of, you know, a significant minority of advanced workers and young people in particular, we found that the word communism was more attractive. So to paraphrase Lenin, it smelled more of revolution. It felt like a clearer break with the old order. So I just thought it was interesting that, you know, Marx and Engels were sort of taking into consideration the weight the different terminology had even in their day, because it's not as though, you know, the same term was used to refer to the Marxists all throughout the history of the movement either.
That's right, yeah.
I mean, if you read certainly the earlier works of Lenin and the leading Bolsheviks, they talk about the Social Democrats. They mean the Marxists. And that's a bit of a historical accident that ended up being the case. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on the choice to call this the Communist Manifesto as opposed to, say, the Socialist Manifesto.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you make. And you're right. It's not, they weren't laying down an abstract principle for all time. They they themselves had to take up the name Social Democrat when they set up the Second International. They weren't fond of the name, even at the time, but they did use the name. And yeah, certain Marxists have described themselves as socialists in different times because often the mood of the working class changes. But and that also reflects something we've touched on time and time again whilst discussing this work, that Marx and Engels are basing themselves on the real development of the working class and the real outlook of the working class. But yeah, it is interesting to read today when the word socialism has become associated with betrayal, to be honest, falling short, simply wanting to tamper with the system. And I guess it's a little bit of a coincidence that it just so happens that this has such a parallel to 1847, 1848, but that was the case. That I think in the manifesto they talk about how even the bourgeoisie is actually quite happy to talk about socialism because there were so many different vague ideas about what it meant. They could just talk about socialism could just be a new housing project. In fact, today, for that matter, I've met lots of people who say that Britain is a socialist country because it has the NHS.
Yes.
I mean, you would have something a bit better than the NHS, but something similar to the NHS under socialism, but it doesn't make Britain a socialist country. NHS isn't literally socialism. It shows the potential. And so it was necessary to cut through that confusion. So you had these socialist ideas were increasingly being seen as safe, really, whereas communism, as we've already discussed from the preamble, was seen as something extremely dangerous and subversive. And I think Marx and Engels wanted to make it absolutely clear that the communists stand for a complete revolution, the overthrow of the existing order, and not simply tampering with it. And I think that was an important statement to make.
All right, well, let's move on to the latter part of the book, Chapter 4, Position of the Communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties. Now, I'm going to refer back to the 1872 preface, where Marx and Engels say that the remarks in this chapter, the specific remarks about the specific parties in question, even though they say that the principles are correct, the practice, the specific particulars are antiquated because the political situation has changed and the progress of history, they write, I quote, has swept from off the earth the greater portion of the political parties there enumerated. So basically, these people were in irrelevance even in 1872. The vast majority of the parties listed here. Yeah. But nevertheless, there's still some important points about method that Marx and Engels draw out in this chapter. And they're talking about their attitude towards and their interventions in and their approach to different workers' parties, but also just different movements for different demands, including democratic demands in different countries. They talk about the Chartists in England. They talk about movements in Switzerland and Germany and Poland. Can you just summarize, Josh, what's the essence of the point that Marx and Engels are making about their attitude towards these parties and these movements?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, to an extent, this part it is certainly of historical. I find it very interesting from a historical point of view to see their position on the different movements. But reading it as a communist, not just for historical interest, really, what you're trying to get out of this part is, well, how do I relate to the movements that exist today?
Yeah.
How did Marx and Engels approach movements in countries with very different conditions in their own day? And I find that is the thing that's particularly fascinating and still completely relevant. This question of method, the way that they thought and the way that they orientated is still completely relevant, even though the conditions are very, very different. And so, I mean, to summarize it, it's really the same as the basic principle of Marxist philosophy, which is you start from reality. We've seen this throughout one thread throughout the whole manifesto, is it always starts with the real concrete conditions and explains those and then proceeds from. To give you an example, I don't want to just talk in abstract terms. When they talk about the program for the workers' movement, they make it explicit that, well, first of all, these are demands that are coming from the movement itself, but also these will develop and may well be replaced over time. When Marx talks about how the working class is born within capitalism, how it forms trade unions and forms political parties, that's drawn entirely from the actual experience of the working class. And so when they're looking at opposition movements in different countries, they are looking at the state of development of the working class and what is the next step, really. So in France, they talk about collaborating with what they refer to as the Social Democrats or Democratic Socialists. I see it given a different form in different versions. Now, these were people around a newspaper called La Réforme, Reform. These were a mixture of radical Democrats and socialists, people who were in favour of a republic in France, people in favour of universal suffrage, and the more socialist wing of the Social Democrats were in favour of the state setting up state workshops to employ the unemployed and gradually outcompeting the capitalists. So they were in favour of revolution to establish republican democracy and then more kind of gradual reform to establish socialism. So not the same as Marx and Engels. And at the time, you can read in their letters, they wanted to critique their ideas on an ideological, a theoretical basis, but they made it explicit. And Engels actually went and met these people in Paris and said, we would like to set up, I think he uses the term cartel, but basically a united front with you. Mm-hmm. You are fighting for the advancement of the working class. Mm-hmm. Therefore, we are prepared to fight alongside you whilst, and the manifesto even says explicitly, whilst retaining the right to criticise any illusions handed over from the French Revolution. That's a reference to their specific limitations that they wanted to criticise. But the essence of this is that where you have a mass workers movement that is fighting for the advancement of the working class, you're not obliged to hop in and join that movement, join that party and then uncritically just cheerlead everything they do. You must really, as a communist, you have a duty to retain your right to criticise and point the real way forward, but you can fight alongside that movement or that organisation in order to achieve common goals. Why? Because what comes out of that is a raising of the consciousness and the strength of the working class. All of these different examples in chapter 4 are related to how can the working class advance even further. To take another, so in France, the working class is relatively more developed. In England, already we've talked about how they support the Chartists, and even participated within the Chartist movement. They were very enthusiastic about a national workers' party that potentially could have seized power. So they did more than simply kind of support from the outside there. But at the other end of the spectrum, you have Switzerland, where they say we support the radicals. The radicals were, they explain themselves, a very mixed bag. Overall, they were radical democratic bourgeois party or movement that were fighting for, against the kind of the vestiges of the old feudal or semi-feudal order in Switzerland. You had these big patricians that dominated the cities, and so you had this democratic bourgeois movement to reduce their power, to fight for the unity of the country, which was parceled up into these cantons, still is. But anyway, to hasten the development of Swiss capitalism, however, with more democratic rights for the working class. In fact, at one point, the radicals did have a more working class wing, who even put forward the demand in Geneva for the right to work, in other words, guaranteed employment. And for a time, they actually won that right. But that was kind of the most extreme wing of the movement. Why do Marx and Engels say they support the radicals in Switzerland, even though it wasn't a workers' party? It wasn't like the Chartists. Because the Swiss working class was so small and so weak and still coming into being at that time, that really, and Marx, I can't remember if it's in the manifesto or elsewhere, but Marx talks about, in its earliest stages, the working class movement is more just an appendage to the democratic bourgeois movement. Definitely in chapter 1, you'll remember that he says that Marx and Engels say that the bourgeoisie kind of exploits the working class politically, like they will give the working class certain political education to use it as a mass force to fight for things that they want.
It reminds me a little bit of the reform crisis in England, where you had a wing of the bourgeoisie that was in favour of expanding the franchise and leaned on the working class in order to fight ultimately its internal battle with a different wing of the ruling class. Thinking of my homeland in Wales, the Merthyr Rising of 1831, that was part of the broader reform crisis. And what happened is you had a section of the iron lords, the iron masters, the big capitalists in South Wales, in Merthyr Tydfil, that deliberately whipped up the proletariat, whipped up their workers in order to fight a battle against a different wing of the bourgeoisie that was trying to restrict their freedoms. But very quickly, once the workers of Merthyr Tydfil were brought into this political fervour, they went a lot further and fought a lot harder than the so-called liberal capitalists had expected, and started in quite a primitive way, in a very early way, but started groping towards their own demands and ultimately seized control of the entire town, and had to be put down by the yeomen with the support, the united support of both the conservative, if you like, the kind of the more openly conservative wing of the ruling class and the so-called liberal ruling class. They ultimately joined forces to crush the Merthyr Rising. So yeah, at this time, in this period, it was often the case that you had these broader democratic struggles waged by a section of the bourgeois that pull the workers behind them, but often are kind of horrified at how much further the working class is able and willing to go. Yeah,
I think that's a great example, and probably one that will have been in Marx's mind when he wrote that first chapter. Don't have time to go into detail, but the 1830 revolution in France, it just replaced one monarchy with another monarchy that was more subservient to the bourgeoisie. But the people who fought and died on the barricades were overwhelmingly working class. So the workers didn't really get much for that revolution, but they were used as cannon fodder, if you like, by the bourgeoisie. And so Marx and Engels they drew the conclusion, based on lots of different examples, not just England. They drew the conclusion that, well, if the workers' movement is so scattered and weak that it doesn't yet have its kind of own independent demands and independent organisation, then communists have no choice really but to support the more general democratic movement, bourgeois democratic movement. But at the same time, and this is crucial, constantly pointing out to the workers that their interests are different and opposed to the bourgeois, even within the same movement. So within the radical movement in Switzerland, raising the level of consciousness of the workers, raising the need from the beginning. So even though they generally support the more progressive wing of the democratic movement, but insisting that the workers need to form their own organisations with their own demands, and at the earliest available opportunity, when they're strong enough to actually enter into direct confrontation with the bourgeoisie, including their current allies. That's an important point here, that it's not just kind of, we're all in this together, let's build a lovely democracy and then we'll talk about socialism. It's, well, this is the real existing state of the movement. This is how it's going to play out, we predict. We can't change that, but what we can do is link the present state of the movement with its future, which goes back to, of course, chapter 2. And I want to touch on another example where the workers' movement was extremely weak, but the country was on the verge of the revolution. That's Germany. And obviously, Marx and Engels' homeland. Everyone was extremely conscious of the inevitability of some kind of revolutionary eruption all over Europe at the beginning of 1848. That also applies to Germany. The Manifesto, which was written and published before the revolution broke out in Germany in March 1848, they say explicitly, Germany is on the verge of a revolution, on the cusp of revolution. against absolutism. So unlike France, which has already overthrown absolutism, and Britain, of course, Germany still has several absolutist monarchies, not just one, and it's completely parceled up into these semi-feudal states. The whole course of history and the development of capitalism demands that that is overcome, that Germany is unified one way or another, and that absolutism is overthrown, and some form of, they predict, their idea was that something like the French Revolution of the 18th century was on the way, but they make this point in the manifesto. Unlike France in the late 18th century, there is a working class. It's a small working class. Half the working class were still organised in guilds in Germany at this time. They're scattered all across the country. We shouldn't overestimate the state of the strength of the German working class, but it was much stronger than the French working class, which barely existed at all at the end of the 18th century. So interestingly, they said, well, this is necessarily a bourgeois revolution. What they mean by that is that a revolution that topples absolutism and unifies Germany it's going to bring the bourgeoisie to power. The working class can't take power. It's too weak. Therefore, it's a bourgeois revolution. They say that the working class in Germany and the communists in Germany fight alongside the bourgeoisie whenever it acts in a revolutionary way. In other words, if it topples absolutism, they fight alongside them to topple absolutism, as they have a common interest. Whilst always, I've already made this point, but whilst always pointing out to the German workers that their interests are always opposed to those of the bourgeoisie, that they need to form their own organisations and to carry on the fight against the bourgeoisie as soon as absolutism is overthrown. So it's and when the revolution breaks out, the Communist League issue a program which basically is the most extreme version of the democratic demands possible, imaginable. Unification of the country under a single indivisible republic, universal suffrage, the expropriation of the emigres, as in reactionary people who flee the country, and other very, very advanced progressive demands. Demands that, on the one hand, are supposedly part of this general bourgeois revolutionary movement, but would be absolutely appalling to the real bourgeoisie. So already, whilst fighting alongside the bourgeoisie, they're trying to drive a wedge between the emerging workers' movement and the bourgeoisie. Now, one little addendum that I'd like to make to this is that the actual experience of 1848 was a little bit different to what they expected. There was a revolution against absolutism for the unification of the country, for a constitution. The bourgeoisie were given more rights so the revolution was led by the working class. It was the working class that came out onto the barricades, but the bourgeoisie and so the absolutist monarchy said, yes, we'll grant a constitution. There'll be a common German parliament that can then decide on the unification of the country and so on. So certain partial gains were won. And as soon as the bourgeoisie found itself in a more leading position, thanks to the workers' uprising, they were so terrified of the workers that they didn't go any further. So I think Marx and Engels were hoping that the bourgeoisie would lead all classes to overthrow the absolutist monarchy, and then in the course of that movement, the working class would be able to develop its own independent position and then turn against the bourgeoisie. A bit like how in the French Revolution, you have the formation of the National Assembly, but then it keeps on going further and further, and you have the sans-culotte. And I think they were hoping that it would reach the point where the workers could play the role of the sans-culotte. But the bourgeoisie in Germany was so weak and cowardly and so terrified by the working class, which of course wasn't such a factor in France, that they betrayed their own revolution. And so actually all of the gains of 1848 in Germany were erased. The bourgeoisie ran into the arms of the absolutist monarchy because they had the armed bodies of men, repressed the revolutionary movement, and Marx and Engels drew the necessary conclusions from that. They said in 1850, after this experience, that the bourgeoisie will never come to power in Germany. They'll never overthrow absolutism because they need it to hold down the rest of the classes. So we can't, they are completely reactionary. The working class is still too weak to take power directly. It's still too much of a small minority. Therefore, the coming revolution in Germany will probably throw the petty bourgeois democracy, the radicals, into power. But the working class should keep hold of any arms it's acquired, form clubs or assemblies or basically organs of working class power, their own working class organizations, in order to push the revolution as far as possible and even eventually depose the petty bourgeoisie. In other words, the onset of the next revolution, even though it still has bourgeois democratic aims like the unification of the country, should be if you like, a continuous process of the working class striving towards the seizure of power. And Marx, in this particular document that I'm talking about, ends it talking about that the rallying cry should be the permanent revolution. So this is something that is a bit of a further development from the manifesto, but still I would say that the method with which they approached the world in 1848 in chapter 4 is still correct.
Okay, well, we told you that there was a wealth of ideas in the Communist Manifesto, and we managed to get a more than 2-hour podcast out of just 34, 35 pages. But one thing that I'd like to end on is the international impact of this book, because Marx and Engels, in subsequent prefaces introducing different translations of the manifesto, talk about the development of the workers' movement in different countries, and they talk about the ideas of the manifesto as applied to the workers' movement in different parts of the world. So, Josh, can you talk about the global impact of the Communist Manifesto, both within the lifetimes of Marx and Engels and subsequently?
Yeah, and one thing that is really striking when you read it today is that, for instance, you read it, there's no mention of Russia, there's no mention of the United States.
Yeah.
Most of the countries of the planet are not mentioned, of course, and these are now countries that are play a huge role in politics, world politics today. And the reason for that is because there basically was no workers' movement in Russia at that time, and the workers' movement was very, very small and only just really coming to being in the United States at that time. So it was natural that Marx and Engels were going to concentrate on where the working class was developing most. But since then, of course, things have changed. And one thing that is I find so inspiring, it's something that Engels draws our attention to in one of the prefaces, where he says that the history of the Communist Manifesto reflects the history of the workers' movement, that every time a working class starts to develop and a revolutionary movement starts to develop in these countries, all of a sudden there's a thirst for ideas, there's rising class consciousness, and workers and young revolutionaries are reaching out for ideas. And where do they reach? They reach to this book. You see this pattern of countries, Poland, Russia, translating into their languages for the first time in order to get the ideas out, not just to promote the ideas, but also so they can understand their own society. A book that was written in Brussels, drawing largely from English and French history, is
by two Germans.
By two Germans, yeah, is being used by Russians to understand very, very different conditions. Why? Because it grasped the logic of capitalist development and the logic of the class struggle. That is what's so powerful. And now you see it's been translated into, as far as I'm aware, every language on the planet. Still, it's an inspiration to workers in Africa, in South America, throughout the entire planet. Why? Because the working class needs these ideas to succeed, to take power. The world needs these ideas to escape from the crisis of capitalism and actually build a communist future fit for mankind.
Well, I think that's an almost perfect note to end on. I'll come back to the real note that I want to end this episode with, and indeed the entire season of the Spectre of Communism podcast and our output for 2025. I hope that you enjoyed this and all of our previous episodes. If you haven't listened and watched all of our episodes up until now, please do. Please give them a like. Please write a comment. Please share them on social media. It really helps us to get the word out. But before we go, I think that we should end this deep dive into the Communist Manifesto with the immortal words with which it is ended, this incredible clarion cry of our movements that really should be etched on the hearts of every communist, every revolutionary throughout the world. So I'll say goodbye before I bring Josh in. I've been Joe Attar. This has been the Spectre of Communism podcast. And to play us out, Josh, would you mind reading the final paragraph of the Communist Manifesto?
Happily. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Workers of the world, unite.
A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism.
Communism is stronger, more determined than ever.
Communist.
Communism. The communists.
The communist.
The communists.
Dedicated to the establishment of a new order.
Just what is communism?
I'll guarantee that 10 minutes from now, a lot of you are going to have a new understanding of communism.